Hello, everyone. I hope all of you are well. Without wasting time, this morning I got to watch a very interesting interview. The interviewer was Mr. Naye Luphondwana, and he was interviewing Pastor Tifu Manyane, a man of God that I have met, and I know him personally. He was my senior at Heidelberg College during my undergraduate years. Cool guy, excellent preacher. And you know, Naye Luphondwana asked some really interesting questions in that interview, and Pastor Tifu Manyane had some really interesting answers. But you know, the questions just got me thinking, and once I start thinking, I want to talk about what I'm thinking about. So I decided to make my own responses to the questions that Naye Luphondwana asked. So this is the video. Enjoy. So I'm going to take clips from the interview, specifically the parts where Naye Luphondwana asks the question, then I'm going to respond to the questions that way. I'm gonna put a link to the full interview and the full video on in the description of this video, so that you can watch the whole thing for yourself. But I hope you enjoy this video. And if you do enjoy it, please hit the like button and please subscribe to this channel, because if you enjoy this video, I guarantee that you're gonna enjoy every other video that I post on this channel. Okay, enjoy.
Why do we have so many different truths if we really have the truth? Pastor Maponga did allege that perhaps there is something wrong with the very whole essence of hermeneutics. I don't know, but this is your chance. From where you stand, why do we have so many truths and yet other faiths, Abrahamic faiths like the Muslims and the Jews, they only have one unanimous undertaking as to what constitutes their truth?
Excellent question by Naye Luphondwana. Let me just say, first of all, on Judaism and Islam, they don't actually have unified understandings of the truth. I'm not an expert on any of those two religions, but I know enough about them to know that they don't have unified views of the truth. Look at Islam. You have ISIS, for example, and you have mainstream Islam, if I can use that phrase, where ISIS and mainstream Islam differ so much, like at a fundamental level, that ISIS even persecutes Muslims who are not members of ISIS because of their views on what Islam is, which means there's a fundamental break between the two when it comes to their understanding of truth in the context of Islam. You go to Judaism and you have Orthodox Judaism, you have Hasidic Judaism, you have Reformed Judaism, you have Messianic Jews, Messianic Judaism. These are all fundamentally different understandings of what truth is according to Judaism. So none of these religions, none of these Abrahamic faiths have unified views of what of what truth is in their context. That a unified understanding of truth just doesn't exist. And even when you look at Christianity, let me say this, I'm not going to expound on it because of time constraints, but let me say, I can make a solid argument that even in Christianity, there has never been a consistent view of what truth is. Or let me say a unified, let me not use the word consistent because that's a bit misleading. Let me say there has never been a unified view of what the truth is. You read the Gospels, just compare the four Gospels with one another. There are differences. Most of the time, the differences are insignificant, but there are some differences that have significant theological implications, which for me, as a Christian and a theologian, or at least a student of theology, these differences, even though the significant ones, don't bring about a crisis of faith. They are actually the reason, they are the stuff that my faith feeds on. But I can't talk a lot about that because of time constraints. I want to come and I want to address the question more directly. about why there are so many different truths. And nested in that question is the assumption that truth is propositional truth. And what do I mean by that? Well, in order to explain what I mean by that, let me just give you a brief and a very brief sketch of, historical sketch of the shifts in the meaning of what truth is in a Christian context, okay? Now, don't use this in an academic paper because I'm going to make a lot of historical jumps. There are entire time periods I'm going to skip, and I'm going to cluster different understandings of truth under two umbrella concepts. And yeah, it works if you're introducing people to the history of theology, at least as far as truth is concerned, but it's not a good answer to use for an academic paper or report. Okay, so the Enlightenment, that's a thing that happened in Europe. You can read about it on Wikipedia. I'm not going to expound on it. Whether we like it or not, the Christianity we have in South Africa, for the most part, is influenced by the West. And the West, for the most part, will forever remain influenced by the Enlightenment and by the Renaissance. You can read about the Enlightenment, as I've already said. But what happened, you can read about the Enlightenment and Enlightenment thinkers like Immanuel Kant, you can read about Hegel, you can read about all of that. But it was the idea that the West has come of age and has developed this intellectual enlightenment, knowing the truth and knowing the true reality of things. It's also the era in which science, as we know it today, began to take the shape that it now has, and scientific inquiry was encouraged. It's the era in human history when monarchy and feudalism were dispelled. It's the time when the French Revolution took place, and so, but it also gave birth to such things as such nations as America, But I'm not going to talk a lot about the Enlightenment. I've already said that. But here's what I want us to focus on the Enlightenment. There was a shift that took place on the meaning of truth. Truth before the Enlightenment, I'm going to cluster it under this umbrella concept of truth as being synonymous with God. Truth before the Enlightenment can be, though this is a problematic way to summarize it, can be summarized as truth is equivalent to God, at least in Christianity. In the West, this is what truth was. It was God. Truth was not a proposition. Truth was not a statement, truth wasn't about the truth of a statement you make about God, but it was the being of God itself. That's what it was before the Enlightenment. But after the Enlightenment, truth became synonymous, or at least during the Enlightenment and after the Enlightenment, truth shifted to being synonymous with reason. And this is because of René Descartes, because when René Descartes went on his I think, therefore I am trip, justification for God was now left to the hands of reason. You needed to use reason to justify the existence of God. And that was a novel thing. Never before had anyone ever thought that you'd use reason to justify God, because God was truth and everything was tested according to God as to whether or not it is truth and to whether or not it's eternal. But with René Descartes, the shift took place, and even God himself was now under scrutiny. He was analyzed and checked out as to whether or not God is true, whether or not God exists. And there was a shift in the meaning of truth when truth became synonymous with reason. Truth became propositional. Truth was no longer being, but truth was now proposition. Propositional truth means the truth, it's the sort of truth you find in true statements. And this is why we have 28 fundamental beliefs in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. 28 fundamental beliefs such as the nature of human beings and the state of the dead. So to say that when human beings die, their souls don't go to heaven because human beings don't have immortal souls, but they just cease to exist. It's a sleep. That's a propositional statement. In other words, that statement is believed to be a statement of truth. It's either true or false. That's a proposition. And if it's true, then it's a propositional truth. And if it's false, then it's, not a propositional truth. It's a false proposition. But the idea that truth is propositional by nature comes from the shift in the definition of truth, from truth being synonymous with God to truth being synonymous with reason. This is also the way in which truth is viewed in science. So this is where science deals with the physical world. And in order to deal with the physical world, you have to deal with propositional truths. For example, when you are dealing with water, water is either a liquid or it's not. So if you say water is a liquid and that is true, that's a propositional truth. Something is either energy or matter. Those are propositional truths. And that's because of the Enlightenment. But God has been put into this Enlightenment bubble as well. That's why we have truth, the idea of truth that we have today. And God has to dance to the music of this post-Enlightenment view of truth. There's more that I can say about this, because this view of truth also gave birth to the idea that the Bible interprets itself. This is because if something is rational, this is again under the category of truth as being synonymous with reason. If something is rational, then it justifies itself, right? And if the Bible is rational and therefore if the Bible is true, then the Bible justifies itself and the Bible interprets itself. That's where this idea comes from. But the problem with that idea, I think, is summed up very well in this book by Ronald E. Osborne. By the way, if you're a Seventh-day Adventist and you're interested in these topics, this is a great book to start. Written by a Seventh-day Adventist scholar, but written for lay people who are not theologians or academics in any way. This is the best place to start. There's an argument he makes which I find very interesting. Okay, I had to put on my glasses so I could read a little bit from this book to you. But speaking on this idea and dispelling this idea, this Seventh-day Adventist scholar, he's brilliant. Look, I read this book 3 years ago, and on my series on the politics of Genesis, I draw a lot from what he says here. And by the way, I would suggest that if you're interested in this topic of the truth, that you watch the introductory video of the politics of Genesis. I'm going to put the link in the description of this video so that you can access that video. I sort of explain what I just said now with a little bit more time, and therefore I think I do a better job of explaining it in that video than I did just now in this video. Okay, so the Bible interprets itself. The Bible does not teach that the Bible should interpret itself. This idea of biblical hermeneutics and truth derived from the Bible is a child of the post-Enlightenment era. It's a child of the Enlightenment, rather, you know. And so it feeds from reason, you know. It's funny because Christians, in response to it's a view of truth that came to exist in response to the criticism of Christianity that comes from Enlightenment philosophy and from science, which is also a child of the Enlightenment. But it responds to these things not by divorcing itself from the philosophical underpinnings of those two endeavors, science and Enlightenment philosophy. No. It responds to them by assuming those philosophical underpinnings as being true. So it assumes that the philosophical understanding of truth that lies behind science as an endeavor is true. And then it says the reason why Christianity is true is because if you use the same philosophical worldview as science, you verify Christianity. And that is a shift from what the Bible was doing. So you end up with such ideas as that the Bible should interpret itself. And this is what Ronald E. Osborne has to say about that. Yet the notion that the Bible ever speaks so unequivocally, or with such immediacy that no interpretation is needed, is itself an interpretation of an interpretation with a highly problematic pedigree. The philosophical school of thought, the school of naive or common sense realism, is itself in need of interpreting, since what is plain or common sense to one person might not be obvious or uncontroversial to another. So that is interesting. There's something else he has to say here. Let me see if I can find the line. Okay. We all bring important background experiences and beliefs about the structure of reality with us to our readings of the text. And this means that there are no plain or purely religious readings of Scripture untainted by philosophical perspectives or by our culturally embedded worldviews. So that's something that I wish I could say more about. In the interview that this question is from at the Kelvin Church stream, Pastor Tifo Manyana actually does say something about how these ideas of truth are influenced by our cultures and upbringing. So, yeah, I wish I could say more about this, but I need to move on to the other questions as well. But maybe before I go, I could also recommend this book. The first book I recommended, this one, by Ronald E. Numbers, is for the lay person who doesn't want to read anything by someone who's not a Seventh-day Adventist. Yeah, then you can read this one. It's a great way to introduce you to these ideas. You don't need a degree in philosophy or in anything to understand that. You just need to be able to read English. The second book was written by this guy. He's not a Seventh-day Adventist. He's a secular scholar, actually, but he's interested in religion. He's a philosopher, John D. Caputo, interested in religion. The book is called Truth, Philosophy in Transit. And he does a great job. This book was not written for academics, by the way. This was written for the interested layperson. So he does a great job at tracing the development of the idea of truth from the biblical times, from the pre-Enlightenment times, through the Enlightenment right up to the present day. I mean, this book was published in 2013. So it's fairly recent. Okay, it was published 7 years ago, but I mean, yeah. Okay, so that's my response to the first question. Let's have a look at the next question and see what we get.